Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we begin with our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, as Ishan Patel has been doing this early and often in the show, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube to make this show as interactive as possible. I always love hearing your thoughts and opinions about all things fantasy sports, fantasy football, especially as we are in the thick of this season. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of today's show. Let's talk about college football and fantasy college football at that. A lot of people have been loving this section of the show. I've been loving it because I want to give these college kids their respect, their flowers, because it's been a very exciting fantasy college football season for a lot of different reasons. One, you're getting so many different performances, and two, the volatility of the top 25 teams, and even teams outside the top 25, has been astonishing to watch. And so I feel like I always love dedicating a segment to the college players who shine each week. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first player who I want to acknowledge is a guy from Kansas State who is probably one of the more underrated players in the country. And if he continues to perform like this, Kansas State will not only be a Big 12 contender, but a CFP contender as well. And that is DJ Giddens. We all know about Avery Johnson and the special talent he brings to this Kansas State offense as a dual-threat player in his first full season as a starter for them. But DJ Giddens was always the guy that was the X factor, the focal point of this offensive attack. And this week against Oklahoma State, in a big game between Big 12 contenders, in a matchup that kind of felt like a must-win for both of these teams, DJ Giddens really proved that he is going to be someone to have a say in the Big 12 and potentially CFP race. 15 carries, 187 yards, 1 touchdown, 27.4 fantasy points. I mean, think about Kansas State. It's a very opportunistic team. They play good football, both offensively and defensively, very hard-nosed team. What it's going to come down to is Avery Johnson, right? This is still a relatively new quarterback, learning as the season progresses, who we all know is a very special talent, but still feels like he's in the nascent stages of his maturity in this offense. So it's all going to come down to, can pieces in the offense supplement him? And DJ Giddens did that to a T this week in a very important matchup, and so I have to shout him out as one of the many running backs around college football who has proven they can be a fantasy star week in, week out. And another guy in the Big 12, a receiver that is not really known around college football, perhaps because this team was not necessarily a huge contender for the Big 12 title, but they are becoming one, and that is Darius Lassiter for BYU. 8 receptions, 107 yards, 1 touchdown in that game against Baylor. It turned out to be a much more exciting game than it needed to be. BYU got up big early. Baylor nearly came back on them. That just shows how competitive the Big 12 is. And BYU, surprisingly, along with Iowa State, another surprise team, are the only undefeated teams in the Big 12. And so I really picked Darius Lassiter because his performance in this BYU offense is perhaps one of the more underrated units in the Big 12, is because BYU is going to need to prove to me that they have big game players for the Big 12, because it's only going to get tougher as it goes along. And I feel like if BYU wants to be taken seriously, a guy like Darius Lassiter needs to continue to put together consistent performances. A game against Baylor is fine and dandy. When you're playing the big boys of the Big 12 who know that they want to compete for that Big 12 title, you're going to have to prove it again. So this performance was good for now, and I'll acknowledge it. 22 fantasy points as well for Lassiter. But it needs to be continuous. It needs to be a performance that is replicated week in, week out, in order for you to prove to me that you have staying power. Not just in the Big 12 conversation, but in the CFP conversation as well. But for now, very impressive performance from Darius Lassiter and BYU as a whole. Next player on this list is a quarterback who a lot of people might have just heard about, especially because of all the drama surrounding this program. I didn't necessarily pick him because, he had, quote-unquote, the best performance of the weekend. I picked him because of the drama surrounding him. But he really proved that no matter the drama, no matter the tension surrounding your program, it's always important to have a good backup quarterback. And as it turns out, UNLV has two. And Malik Williams, I'll skip ahead a little bit, proved himself this week. As we all know, Matthew Sluka shockingly left the program over an NIL dispute, and they seem to be in a weird place. But Barry Odom, let's just go to show the trust he has in his quarterbacking room. And Malik Williams, sixth-year senior out of Campbell, impressive career at Campbell nonetheless. He comes in and proves that depth is going to matter, especially if you're a group of 5 team like UNLV is competing for that one CFP spot that you're going to get. So it's going to be highly integral for Malik Williams to put up performances like this, but 13 of 16, 182 yards through the air, 3 touchdowns, 12 carries, 119 yards on the ground, and 1 touchdown, a total of 37.2 fantasy points. If this is what we're going to continue seeing out of this kid, then UNLV might just be penciled in as the Group of 5 representative. I think that there are a lot of interesting teams from the Group of 5 that you can look at. Tulane might still be in the conversation. Boise State having their own big offensive weapon, Ashton Jeanty. A lot of interesting teams in that debate. Maybe even Army and Navy as well. Who knows? But Malik Williams proved that UNLV might have staying power as well. And going back to some wide receiver performances, like I said, how about impressive sophomore from UFC, Jacoby Lane. 10 receptions, 105 yards, 27.5 fantasy points in their win against Wisconsin. And I picked Jacoby Lane because when I think about USC and their offense, it is highly predicated on how they develop the quarterback, because that's what Lincoln Riley does, right? He develops quarterbacks. And Miller Moss looked very impressive in this game, leading them from a mini comeback. I believe they were 21-10 down to a 38-21 win at home against Wisconsin. But when I look at USC's wide receiver room, it's very young, very versatile, maybe not as well known as other wide receiver rooms in the Big Ten in and around college football, but Jacoby Lane is a name you might be hearing a lot more often. I feel like he is going to be someone who, in this USC offense, is going to be someone that Miller Moss can rely upon throughout the year, because Miller Moss is very different from what Caleb Williams brought to the position, right? He's going to be a pocket passer. He wants to pick you apart. And Jacoby Lane is a very skilled route runner, is someone who I can rely upon in the red zone, and most importantly, can keep USC in a ton of Big Ten games, much like they did against Wisconsin. So Jacoby Lane, look out for him as a sneaky, interesting weapon in that young wide receiver room over at USC for Miller Moss. The last player I want to talk about is DeAndre Moore Jr. Speaking of unknown players, but in a much bigger wide receiver room, much more well-renowned wide receiver room over there at Texas, the number 2 team in the land. DeAndre Moore Jr. has become someone who, more often than not, is relied upon as not just a solid depth piece, but as a vertical threat for this offense. And over the past couple of weeks, he's proven that his verticality is going to be hard for SEC teams to defend as Texas begins SEC play a little more in depth in a couple of weeks. 4 receptions, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns in a game where they needed all of them, Texas. 24.3 fantasy points for him. And look, I know that guys in that Texas room like Isaiah Bond, Matthew Bolden are going to be more well-renowned. They're going to be names that you hear more often. But DeAndre Moore has gained the trust of Steve Sarkisian. He's gained the trust of both his quarterbacks in Quinn Ewers and Archer Manning. Most importantly, he's really saying that, hey, not only do you have to worry about the Bonds and Goldens of the world, you have to worry about me as well. I can stretch the field as well. I can make some big plays down the field. And that's what makes Texas so dangerous, right? The depth of this wide receiver room is what makes them so dangerous. And I want to award DeAndre Moore as well, because he is someone who I haven't even really heard of as a Texas fan myself. as someone who could really step up and be an integral part of that team, but he has shown it. I could have mentioned a lot more names as well for this list. I could have mentioned Jalen Milroe. What a brilliant dual threat performance by the Alabama QB in a game where he kind of felt like he wanted to prove that Alabama wasn't going anywhere. I mean, yes, you can look at that valiant comeback effort from Georgia as perhaps a precursor to Alabama's defense not being able to sustain their offense as much, but overall, Jalen Milroe kind of taking this team on his back and carrying them to victory was very reminiscent of a lot of different Alabama QB performances over the years. I could have mentioned even Arch Manning as well. What an impressive job in potentially his final game, filling in for Quinn Ewers of the season, in, weathering a sloppy start for this Texas team against Mississippi State, and just keeping them on track, staying the course, and potentially playing one of his best games as a Texas Longhorn. I could have looked at, Aston G.T. himself, another Heisman Trophy candidate. I feel like, he has been getting a lot of disrespect because of the fact he's a group of 5 guy and because he's a running back. But you can't ignore performances where he's putting up over 250 yards rushing, putting up 4 touchdowns on the board. He's literally a video game player come to life, Aston G.T. And if Boise State, is turning out to be the group of 5 representative best equipped to go into the CFP, make some noise, he very well should be considered. And last but not least, I could have picked Travis Hunter as well, perhaps the best overall two-way player in the history of college football. This guy is doing incredible things, and Colorado just gets realer and realer by the week. I don't necessarily know if it's going to be sustainable in the competitive Big 12, but their performances warrant attention, and Travis Hunter himself warrants attention. He is not bland like others might think, but at the end of the day, these players that I've compiled all go to show the depth of fantasy college football at every single skill position. But I hope you guys enjoyed this segment. Coming up next, we return to talk of football, and most importantly, tonight's doubleheader in the NFL. Titans, Dolphins, Seahawks, Lions. We're talking all things Monday Night Football from a betting perspective. You definitely don't want to miss what's ahead. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your